Hello and welcome to Sleepy Short Stories, where tonight we take a detour from the sweet and peaceful to the downright disturbing. As you settle in for the night, make sure your doors are locked and your windows are shut tight, because tonight we're going to share three chilling bedtime horror stories that will haunt your dreams. So, if you're brave enough, get comfy, but not too comfy. These stories may leave you questioning what lurks in the shadows long after the lights are out. Remember, if you enjoy these tales of terror, give a thumbs up, subscribe, and ring the bell so you're never alone when the darkness falls. The Whispering Woods. Once upon a time, nestled in the shadow of jagged mountains, there was a quiet little village called Evernight. The villagers were kind folk who loved to tell stories, especially tales of mystery and fear. But there was one story they never told lightly, the tale of the Whispering Woods. The woods lay just beyond the village, a dark and sprawling forest, with trees so ancient their branches twisted together like the knotted fingers of an old crone. During the day, the woods seemed normal enough. Birds sang, sunlight filtered through the leaves, and children played at its edges. But at night, the forest came alive with whispers. The villagers believed the whispers were voices of the lost, people who had entered the woods and never returned. They call to you, old Eliza, the village herbalist, would warn. They'll promise you anything, but don't listen. Once you hear the whispers, they'll follow you forever. No one knew if the story was true, but no one dared test it, except for Elias. Elias was 14 years old, full of curiosity and bravery that often bordered on recklessness. He'd grown up hearing the warnings about the Whispering Woods, but he had never seen anything strange there during the day. He thought the tales were just stories meant to scare children. So, one cold autumn evening, when the moon was full and the air crisp, Elias decided to prove that the Whispering Woods were nothing to fear. With a lantern in hand, he crept out of his home after dinner and walked to the forest's edge. The village was silent, everyone tucked safely away in their homes. Only the distant hoot of an owl broke the stillness. The trees loomed before him, their branches clawing at the sky. For a moment, Elias hesitated. The stories played in his mind, each warning echoing like a drumbeat. But then he took a deep breath and stepped forward, his boots crunching on the dry leaves. The forest was eerily quiet at first. The wind rustled the leaves, but that was all. Elias walked along a narrow path, the glow of his lantern casting flickering shadows. He whispered to himself to keep his courage up. It's just a forest, nothing to be afraid of. But as he ventured deeper, the air grew colder, and the stillness became oppressive. Then, faintly at first, he heard it, a soft murmur like the sound of distant voices. Elias stopped and listened. The whispers were faint, just on the edge of hearing, but they seemed to come from every direction at once. Elias, the whispers breathed, come closer. His heart raced, but he told himself it was only the wind. Hello? He called out, his voice trembling. There was no reply, just the whispers growing louder, swirling around him like invisible threads. As Elias pressed on, the path grew narrower, the trees more twisted. He reached a small clearing where the air felt thick and heavy, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. In the center of the clearing stood a massive tree, its trunk gnarled and split open like a wound. Strange charms hung from its branches, made of twigs, bones, and bits of cloth. They swayed gently, though there was no breeze. Then he saw her. A girl about his age stepped out from behind the tree. Her hair was black as the shadows, and her pale skin seemed to glow in the lantern light. Her eyes were dark and deep, like twin pools of ink. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice soft and lilting. Elias stared at her, his fear momentarily forgotten. "Who are you?" he asked. "I'm Mira," she replied, tilting her head. "Are you lost?" "No," Elias said, though he wasn't so sure anymore. "I was just curious." Mira's lips curved into a faint smile. "Curiosity is dangerous here. Do you know the secret of these woods?" Elias shook his head. The whispers around them grew louder, as if urging Mira to speak. "The forest doesn't like intruders," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The whispers you hear, they're warnings. This place traps those who don't belong. Once you hear the whispers, they'll follow you, forever." Elias felt a chill run down his spine. "That's not true," he said, trying to sound brave. "I can leave whenever I want." Mira's smile faded. She stepped aside, gesturing to the path he'd come from. But when Elias turned, he saw only endless trees, their trunks forming a labyrinth of shadows. The path was gone. Panic surged through him. "What did you do?" he demanded. "It's not me," Mira said. "It's the woods. They've taken you now." "No!" Elias shouted. He turned and ran, his lantern swinging wildly. The whispers rose to a crescendo, voices overlapping in a maddening chorus. "Elias, stay. Elias, don't go." The forest seemed to shift around him, the trees closing in. No matter which direction he ran, he always ended up back at the clearing. Mira was there each time, watching him with sad eyes. "You can't run," she said softly. "The forest won't let you." Elias refused to believe her. He ran again, deeper into the woods, ignoring the whispers and the shadows that seemed to move on their own. His lantern flickered, the light growing dimmer with each step. Finally, he stumbled and fell, the lantern shattering on the ground. Darkness swallowed him whole. When he opened his eyes, he was back in the clearing. The great twisted tree loomed above him, its charms swaying like mocking laughter. Mira knelt beside him, her expression unreadable. "You shouldn't have come here," she said. "Now you're like me." "Like you," Elias whispered. "What do you mean?" Mira stood and stepped back, her form beginning to fade. "The whispers called me too, long ago. I didn't listen to the warnings, and now I'm part of the forest, just like you will be." Elias tried to reach for her, but his hand passed through her as if she were made of mist. The last thing he saw before she vanished completely was the sadness in her eyes. To this day, if you stand at the edge of the whispering woods at dusk, you might hear Elias's voice among the whispers, calling for help, begging to be found. But no one dares to answer, because everyone knows that once you hear the whispers, they'll never let you go. The Clockmaker's Curse. In the heart of an old cobblestone city stood a peculiar shop known only as Timeless Wonders. The windows were frosted over, as though hiding secrets, and the air around the building always seemed colder than the rest of the street. It was said that the clockmaker, Mr. Carvin, had a talent that bordered on the supernatural, crafting clocks so intricate and precise that they seemed alive. No one ever saw him enter or leave the shop. Rumors swirled that he lived in the attic above his store and worked by candlelight deep into the night. Some said his clocks didn't just tell time, they trapped it. One chilly evening, 11-year-old Nora passed by the shop with her mother. Nora was a curious girl, often asking questions that made adults pause. That night, as she peered through the frosted glass, she saw a grand clock inside with hands that didn't move. Instead, the numbers seemed to shift on their own, glowing faintly. "Don't stare too long," her mother warned, pulling her away. "That shop is strange, and Mr. Carvin's stranger still." But Nora couldn't stop thinking about the clock, the way it seemed to hum softly, almost as if calling to her. Against her better judgment, she decided to return alone the next day. The bell above the shop door jingled softly as Nora stepped inside. The air was heavy with the scent of oil and old wood. The walls were lined with clocks of every shape and size, their ticking forming a chaotic symphony. At the center of it all stood the grand clock she had seen the night before. Up close, its numbers glowed brighter, and the faint hum was unmistakable. "Ah, a curious one," a voice rasped behind her. Nora spun around to see Mr. Carvin. He was tall and thin, with eyes that seemed too bright for his gaunt face. His hands were stained with oil, his nails blackened with years of work. "You like my masterpiece?" he asked, gesturing to the grand clock. "It's beautiful," Nora said, unable to look away. "But why don't the hands move?" Mr. Carvin smiled, revealing teeth too sharp and too white. "Ah, because this clock doesn't tell time, my dear. It holds it." Before she could ask what he meant, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small golden pocket watch. "Here," he said, pressing it into her hand. "A gift for such a curious soul." The watch was warm, its surface engraved with strange, swirling patterns. "Thank you," Nora whispered, though a chill ran down her spine. "Remember," Mr. Carvin said, his voice low, "time is precious. Use it wisely." That night, Nora lay in bed, the pocket watch clutched in her hand. She felt a strange comfort holding it, even as a soft ticking seemed to echo in her ears. When she finally drifted to sleep, her dreams were vivid and strange. She found herself standing in a vast, endless room filled with clocks. The air was thick, and the ticking was deafening. In the center of the room stood the grand clock from the shop, its numbers glowing brighter than ever. As she approached, the hands began to move backward, and the world around her seemed to blur. She woke with a start, the watch still warm in her hand. The next day, strange things began to happen. Nora noticed the clock in her kitchen ticking slower than usual. At school, hours seemed to stretch endlessly, while at other times they sped by in a blink. Her friends complained of headaches and moments of confusion, but Nora felt fine. In fact, she felt sharper, more aware. She began to experiment with the pocket watch, turning its hands backward and forward. Each time she did, the world around her shifted subtly. A broken vase would mend itself, a spilled drink would return to its cup. But with each use, the watch grew warmer, and the ticking in her ears grew louder. One evening, as Nora sat in her room, the watch began to tick faster on its own. The air grew heavy, and a shadow fell over her desk. When she looked up, Mr. Carvin was standing in the corner of her room. "You've been playing with time," he said, his voice a low growl. Nora froze. I didn't mean to. I just wanted to fix things." "Time is not a toy," he snapped. "Every second you steal must be paid back." Before she could respond, he vanished, leaving behind only the faint scent of oil and a single ticking sound that echoed endlessly in her mind. Over the next few days, Nora's world began to unravel. The more she used the watch, the more unstable time became. Her parents would forget entire conversations. Her friends would disappear for moments, only to reappear as if nothing had happened. Even her reflection in the mirror seemed wrong, her movements slightly out of sync. Desperate, she returned to timeless wonders. The shop was darker than before, the clocks ticking erratically. Mr. Carvin stood by the grand clock, his face grave. "I told you," he said. "Time demands balance." "How do I fix it?" Nora pleaded, tears streaming down her face. He pointed to the grand clock. "You must give it back." "But how?" He handed her a key, cold and heavy. "The clock will take what it is owed." Nora hesitated, but knew she had no choice. She climbed onto the platform before the grand clock and inserted the key. As she turned it, the clock's numbers began to glow brighter, and the hands moved faster and faster. The room filled with a deafening hum. Suddenly, she felt herself being pulled toward the clock, her body growing weightless. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing she saw was Mr. Carvin watching her, his expression unreadable. When Nora's parents reported her missing, the police found no trace of her. The only clue was a golden pocket watch left on her desk, its ticking silent. At Timeless Wonders, a new clock appeared in the window. It was smaller than the grand clock, but bore a striking resemblance to Nora. Its hands moved backward, and its numbers glowed faintly, as though alive. And if you listened closely, you could almost hear a voice whispering from within. "Time is precious. Use it wisely." The shadow in the mirror. Long before the village stood where it is now, deep in the thick of the forest, there was an abandoned house. Its walls were made of rotting wood, and its roof, once a proud shelter, sagged under the weight of time. It had been empty for many years, the windows filled with dust and webs, the door hanging loosely on its hinges. The villagers knew it well, but avoided it, especially after dark. Whispers traveled from one neighbor to the next, always in hushed tones, about the strange occurrences that had once plagued the house. No one ever stayed long enough to prove them true, but the stories stuck like tar. They say that on certain moonless nights, you could still hear the sounds of footsteps echoing through its halls, or the distant murmur of voices. But the most terrifying part? The mirror. It was an old, gilded thing, imposing in size and ornately carved with dark designs that seemed to shift when you weren't looking at them directly. The villagers, who had spent their entire lives avoiding that place, spoke in fearful tones of a shadow that had once been trapped inside the mirror. Some said it was the spirit of a man who had died in the house many years ago, and that the mirror was somehow tied to his curse. Others claimed the shadow was something far older, something born in the very earth beneath the house, waiting to break free. But no one knew for sure, not even the oldest of villagers. All that was known was that anyone who had ever ventured inside the house had left in a hurry, pale-faced and trembling, claiming that the shadow had followed them home. The story of the mirror had been passed down for generations, but none of the young people in the village truly believed in it. Until Sam came along. Sam was different from the other children in the village. While they played in the fields and stayed close to their homes, Sam was a wanderer, drawn to the wild woods that stretched endlessly beyond the village boundaries. He had always been curious about the mysterious house, its weathered appearance calling to him like a riddle waiting to be solved. His friends would warn him about the stories, but Sam was brave, or foolish enough, not to believe them. He scoffed at the idea of a shadow trapped in a mirror. It was on a particularly gloomy afternoon that Sam, with a quiet resolve, decided to explore the house for himself. The sun had hidden behind thick clouds, and the air had a chill to it that hinted at rain. Sam could feel the tension in the air as he made his way through the dense trees. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the forest itself was urging him to turn back. But Sam ignored it. As he approached the house, he noticed that the front door creaked slightly in the wind, as though inviting him in. His heart raced, but he forced himself to take another step, then another, until he was standing on the front porch. The wooden planks beneath his feet groaned with age, but Sam didn't care. He pushed the door open and stepped into the darkness beyond. The house was cold, and the air tasted stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that crept in through the cracks in the walls. The floorboards were uneven, and each step echoed through the house, amplifying the silence. Sam's eyes adjusted to the dimness as he moved deeper into the house, the wooden floor creaking underfoot. He passed through rooms filled with forgotten furniture, their shapes barely visible under layers of dust. Old paintings hung crookedly on the walls, their subjects staring out with hollow eyes, their smiles frozen in time. Sam moved cautiously, his curiosity outweighing his growing unease. Finally, he came to the room that was most talked about, the living room where the mirror stood. It was larger than he had imagined, framed in dark, twisted vines that seemed to pulse with life. The glass itself rippled as though it wasn't made of solid material. For a moment, Sam simply stared at it, captivated by the strange movement within. He stepped closer, his breath catching in his throat, and that's when he saw it. At first, it was just a faint distortion in the glass, a shadow that didn't belong. But then it became clearer. The shadow seemed to flicker and shift, as though it was trying to break free from the mirror's hold. Sam's heart thudded in his chest, but he couldn't tear his gaze away. The shadow was not like any shadow he had ever seen. It was tall and thin, its features indistinct, yet somehow familiar. It seemed to bend and twist in unnatural ways, stretching out towards Sam as though it was trying to reach through the glass. Then, to Sam's shock, the shadow moved. It wasn't just a reflection. It was alive. It stepped forward from the mirror, its movements jerky and unnatural, as though it was testing the boundaries of the glass that kept it contained. Sam stumbled back, his breath coming in quick gasps. He wanted to run, but his feet felt glued to the floor. The shadow seemed to notice him for the first time, its form twisting toward him with an eerie, fluid motion. "I see you," it whispered, its voice like the scraping of nails on stone. Sam froze. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but he couldn't move. "I'm trapped," the voice continued, its tone growing more desperate. "I need you to help me." Sam's mind raced. He knew he should leave, but there was something hypnotic about the shadow's voice. It was as if it knew his deepest desires, knew what he truly wanted. "I can give you everything you've ever wanted," the shadow coaxed, its form growing clearer, more solid. "Power, riches, freedom." Sam swallowed, his fear warring with the temptation. He wanted to run, but he found himself drawn toward the mirror, toward the shadow. He stepped closer, closer until he could feel the chill radiating from the glass. "No," Sam whispered, his heart pounding in his chest. "You're not real." But the shadow didn't like that. A low growl rumbled from within the mirror, and the shadow's form stretched out further, as though it was being pulled from the glass by some unseen force. "You don't get to refuse me," it snarled, its voice now a guttural roar. The mirror cracked, thin, jagged lines spreading across the surface like a spider's web. Sam's eyes widened in terror as the mirror shattered with a loud crack, sending a surge of darkness spilling out into the room. The shadow leaped toward him, its form becoming a blur of blackness. He turned and ran, faster than he had ever run in his life. He didn't look back, didn't dare to. He burst out of the house and into the cold, dark forest, his heart pounding in his chest, his legs screaming in pain as he pushed himself harder and harder. When he finally reached home, breathless and shaking, he slammed the door behind him and locked it tight. He didn't feel safe, though. That night, as Sam lay in bed, trying to calm his racing heart, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He glanced toward the mirror on his bedroom wall, and his stomach twisted. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw something move. Just a shadow, but it wasn't his. Sam pulled the blankets over his head, but the shadow was still there, waiting, lurking just beyond the edge of his vision. The next morning, Sam thought it was a nightmare. The mirror seemed normal again, and he felt foolish for even believing that the shadow had been real. But as the days passed, he began to notice it more and more. It was in the reflection of puddles, in the windows of passing carriages, in the silver surface of a spoon. The shadow was always there, lurking in the corner of his vision, just beyond his reach. Sam didn't know how to escape it. The shadow followed him everywhere. And one night, it whispered again, "Come back to the mirror. I'm waiting." And so the story goes, warning those who dare glance into the mirrors of their homes. If you see something moving that shouldn't be, if you hear a voice calling your name from within the glass, don't turn back. You may not be able to escape. For once the shadow escapes, it will never let you go. That's all for now. Good night and sleep tight. If you are still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe for more bedtime stories.